things went wrong. American troops and a lot of Somalis were killed. Clinton pulled out, and American public opinion was very unhappy. To some extent, Clinton's experience reminds one of an earlier Democratic president, Woodrow Wilson. In 1919, after Wilson had helped to win World War I and tried to structure the peace by exporting American ideals, Congress, then as now Republican-led, withdrew from involvement in the affairs of a wicked world. The United States refused to join the League of Nations. For 20 years, as things went from bad to worse in Europe, the United States retreated into isolation. Now, since the Somalia experience, many Americans seem again to have turned away from an expansive internationalist approach. Polls show deep suspicion of the United Nations. Republicans are pressing for substantial cuts in foreign aid and for the abolition of a number of government agencies, which they see as giving away American money to foreigners to no good purpose. Does that mean that after 75 years, isolationism is on the way back? Peter Rodman was a close associate of Dr. Henry Kissinger and a foreign policy advisor to Presidents Reagan and Bush.
The good news is that isolationism is still a pejorative term in the American debate. One is put on the defensive when one is accused of being an isolationist, and that's a good sign. It is not respectable to be isolationist, and it's good to have both parties arguing, oh, no, we're good internationalists. The president's problem is twofold. One is, at the end of the Cold War, all of the democracies have the same dilemma. The publics are more preoccupied with domestic issues. That is inevitable and not harmful. The second problem is this particular president has a crisis of confidence in America, particularly on the question of military intervention. The incompetence that it has displayed over the last 3 years is palpable, and the public, therefore, does not give him the benefit of the doubt when he says, oh, we must go into this place.
Not surprisingly, perhaps, he cites his former boss, George Bush, as an example of what strong leadership can achieve.
I think the Gulf War demonstrated that America is not isolationist. The American people are not isolationist. That was an extraordinary challenge that they faced up to, a challenge of a post-Cold War nature, because of good leadership. I mean, a president who explained between August 1990 and January 91 that something was at stake, and the American people were ready to face that. And in fact, we all remember everyone expected it to be a much bloodier and more difficult thing than it turned out to be, but the public was ahead of the Congress on this. I was in the Nixon White House during the Vietnam period, and we had a near civil war in this country. For about 5 years, we were in an isolationist mood in this country and shied away from intervention. And I think the Gulf War demonstrated the degree of our recovery from that.
To say that it's just a question of presidential leadership, though, is surely too simple. The Gulf War seemed much more clear-cut than Bosnia does, both in terms of the interests involved and of the prospects for a victorious conclusion. The new debate is over how widely America's interests extend, and it's overturned the traditional alignments. During the Cold War, conservative Republicans never ceased to argue vigorously in favor of American leadership abroad and for the promotion of American values. Now a Democrat is making the case for internationalism against Republican opposition. And it's among the American right that the confusions about America's role are most evident. One of the rising stars of the right is Christopher Cox, a former official in the Reagan White House and now chair of the Republican Policy Committee in the House of Representatives. Although he opposes the administration's Bosnia policy, his instincts about America's role in the world are ambitious.
We are no longer in a chiefly bipolar world in which the West faces off against a nuclear superpower of the type that was willing, at least nominally, to threaten us on a daily basis. The new world with which we are left is one in which there are at least as many grave threats taken collectively, but one in which the threats are not so easy to pinpoint and not so easy, therefore, to prepare against. Our foreign policy, as a consequence, needs to be directed in two ways. First, to expanding human freedom and vindicating human rights around the world, and second, to maximizing the personal security of people throughout the world from foreign aggression and internal dictatorship.
That's a pretty large agenda. I mean, if you're really going to say that the United States is going to intervene to protect all the people whose human rights are being threatened, that can be a very large agenda indeed.
Well, of course, that is not workable. There are simply too many nations on Earth and too many places where abuses are being committed for the UK, the United States, or any democratic or free country to intervene. What we can and must do is use our resources sparingly so that people throughout the world understand that there are consequences to aggression, that there are limits beyond which the civilized world will not be pushed.
Christopher Cox's apparent self-contradiction illustrates the real dilemma for conservatives. They hate the idea of spending American taxpayers' money on wild-goose adventures of limited relevance. But on the other hand, they cherish the idea of America standing up for its ideals in the world. Jean Kirkpatrick also worked for the Reagan administration as ambassador to the United Nations. She has agonized over what should be done in Bosnia, but she concludes that American leadership must now be selective.
I don't think the United States has a natural vocation for providing military or foreign policy leadership to the whole world in our century. I really don't. I think there have been some problems in which we were uniquely suited to help. In those cases, I think it was important that we acted, in fact, the World War II being the most dramatic example. Even Korea, I think, was important. The whole Truman Doctrine and NATO and Marshall Plan and so forth, I think that was enormously important to do. But I don't think that means, therefore, that we are uniquely qualified or obliged to continue to try to provide the solution to all the problems that continue to exist forever. You know, there are a lot of competent countries and people in the world, and they are generally better suited to deal with their own affairs than we are. So if that means that I don't support American leadership role every place, then so be it. I see our role as a sort of active membership in support of and participation, and where necessary leadership, in support of those activities in which we have a large concern.
So the Republicans, while opposing the president, have no consistent alternative to offer. Some, like Jean Kirkpatrick, are convinced by the case for limiting American involvement. But others, like Peter Rodman, think that American leadership is still needed across the entire world.
The American role is a pivotal one. We need to be the balancer, the stabilizer, the source of reassurance. I think that role in Europe is still pivotal. And there's no one single overwhelming geopolitical threat, but there is a problem of the structure of world politics, which is rather unstable. And the Americans have played this balancing role. This has been one of the functions we have been performing the last 40 years. And it turns out to be still quite relevant. Now, in addition, you have the regional thugs, the North Koreans, the Iraqis, the Iranians, who have hegemonial ambitions in certain regions that are important to us. And so that again, without the Americans, it's hard to see how you can insure against that. So without us, I think there is great instability. And this is not arrogance, nor is it a very difficult role for us to play, because we've been doing it. I mean, in addition to deterring the Soviets, we have been playing the secondary role of being the stabilizer in general. And that role continues.
Whatever the divisions among Clinton's Republican opponents, one thing is clear. They're none of them isolationists, as the term has traditionally been used. It's still only outside the political mainstream that you find people who argue for a more radical change. Ronald Steele, professor of international relations at the University of Southern California, is one of the most prominent left-wing thinkers on foreign policy. He argues that America can no longer afford anything near the level of commitments it's become used to making around the world.
What we find for the first time since the beginning of the Cold War is the erosion of the consensus that foreign policy must take precedence over domestic policy. That has been eroding for some time and has now, I think, become crucial because the United States no longer has that great surplus that allowed it to do both.
When people talk, as they do, about the last superpower, you're saying that in a way the United States is not a superpower at all.
It's a superpower only in the sense that it's far more powerful than any other power. It has a bigger economy than anybody else. It has a bigger nuclear force. But the nuclear force isn't particularly relevant for the kind of challenges that the United States faces today. And in terms of the global economy, it may be bigger, but it's subject to enormous strains and competition from outside, and therefore, no, it can't do everything it wants to do. It can't even do many of the things that it ought to do. It's fueling the global economy, and so it's less of a superpower than a kind of a cash cow, if you will, that keeps things going, but at a very great cost domestically, and I don't think that's sustainable.
Michael Lind, now a senior editor with the New Republic, was until recently the editor of a conservative journal. He agrees that foreign policy experts, both conservative and liberal, are simply out of step with a new public mood.
Well, there's not an intellectual reassessment going on within the foreign policy elite of policymakers and academics and journalists. In fact, rather surprisingly, since the end of the Cold War, there's been a new consensus that the United States must maintain its preeminent superpower position and, if anything, extend it into the areas from which the Soviet Union is withdrawn by the extension of NATO, for example. Continuing to take the lead in security and economic matters in East Asia. But at the same time that the American foreign policy elite has been coming up with this rather grandiose vision of an American-dominated 21st century, popular support for our existing commitments, to say nothing for new commitments, has been plummeting since the end of the Cold War. So I think that the reassessment that's taking place is on the part of the voting public, but it's not taking the form of a new school of thought within the elite.
What is public opinion saying?
Well, public opinion supports U.S. leadership on two conditions: that it costs no money and that no lives be lost.
That may sound cynical at a time when President Clinton has just asked the American people to spend money and risk lives in Bosnia. But Congressman Lee Hamilton from Indiana, the leading Democrat on the House International Relations Committee, is very aware of how out of step Washington may be with the rest of the country.
There's a tremendous gap between the foreign policy elite in this country and ordinary Americans, and it's very strong, very noticeable for any politician. The world's a complicated place, it's a dangerous place, and the ordinary American really doesn't follow foreign policy events very carefully. So there's a huge gap here, and any leader who is internationalist in his or her view finds in their constituencies real challenges to that kind of a position. So this worries me. I mean, this is one of the major problems in America today, this huge gap between the foreign policy elite and ordinary Americans and their view of America's role in the world.
There is a good deal of poll data to substantiate Lee Hamilton's instinct. Earlier this year, for example, a survey found that only 1% of leaders, but nearly 30% of the public, wanted America to stay out of world affairs. But Strobe Talbot, Deputy Secretary of State, is convinced that, properly educated, American public opinion does still support a leadership role.
I do believe that there is still very widespread support, and I say that on the basis of my own travels around the country as well as what I can see in polling and that kind of thing. But during the Cold War, you could reduce the rationale for the United States to be fully engaged abroad literally to a bumper sticker, to a 2 or 3 word slogan: stop communism, deter Soviet aggression. And there's no equivalent in the post-Cold War period for that kind of bumper sticker, although there is a rationale for it, but it just takes a little bit more time to make, a little bit more care and attention on the part of the public to understand. The case basically is this in a nutshell. It is an increasingly interdependent world in which we live. The United States depends to an increasing extent on what happens in other countries for its ability to maintain its level of prosperity, as well as its security. Now, interdependence can either work to our advantage or to our disadvantage. And if we, the United States, play a vigorous leadership role, interdependence is more likely to work to our advantage.
Globalization, or interdependence, doesn't make for good bumper stickers. When Bill Clinton was campaigning for the presidency, he emphasized that he'd focus on domestic issues. "It's the economy, stupid," was the slogan, and he even jeered at George Bush as a foreign policy president. But he soon realized that in many fields, what happens in America is affected by what happens elsewhere in the world. This is true of drugs or terrorism, and nowhere more than in the field of trade. So, more than any previous administration, Clinton and his people made the effort to open up freer trade a key dimension of its foreign policy. Godfrey Hodgson, now a Yale professor, was Deputy Secretary of Commerce and one of Clinton's top trade strategists.
When we think about the strength of our own country, the economy looms very, very large. The question of good jobs for Americans, better standards of living, a higher morale, all relating to the strength of our communities. And increasingly, trade is integral to all that. So I think that from a very, very basic standpoint, economic considerations are seen as really national security considerations. What few Americans really understand is how woven into our economy now are exports and imports. We have a mentality that we are basically self-sufficient, or that trade is marginal to the lives of most Americans. In fact, that's changed really dramatically just in the last decade. By the end of this century, and just 4 or 5 years from now, over 16 million American jobs are going to be associated with exports. And if you add imports and the distribution systems, it'll be probably double that. So a very, very substantial part of our workforce is now wrapped up in the international economy, which would not be surprising if we were a European country. But for us, this is really a dramatic change.
For that very reason, Clinton has given the removal of barriers to American exports an even higher priority than the Reagan administration did. The implication is that countries like Japan or Germany that were primarily seen in the Cold War context as allies could come to be seen more as trading rivals.
I think that we have not yet reached the level of aggressiveness that we need to really offset the kinds of attitudes that we had in the past. I think we have a good start, but we need to be relentless and pressing abroad for more open markets that approximate the openness of our market. I think that our firms need to be much more aggressive and certainly must take a longer-term view of their interests. I'd like to see a lot of changes in Washington, all aiming towards a more aggressive international economic policy.
To dispel any alarm you may be feeling, the word aggressive in American business speak doesn't mean much more than energetic, which is perhaps why the professor goes on to say America should be super aggressive. What he's calling for is not more Japan bashing, but a more open trading environment, which he believes will help everyone in the long run. He's sure that in relation to international trade, Americans have no wish to close themselves off from the outside world.
If you go to places like California or Texas or Illinois, New England, you just come across vast numbers of people whose number one concern about our foreign policy is trade. And it's not that we should stop trade and not that we should be protectionist. Exactly the opposite. The question I keep getting, I used to get when I was in the government is, what are we doing to capture foreign markets? No one ever said, how come we're importing so much? It's what can we do to sell more? There is a very deep-seated intuition in the American public that something is changing and we have to be part of it. And also, I would say, a confidence that if we really focus on these issues, we'll do really well.
American industry has been investing and modernizing, and products and services from many giant American corporations, not to mention American wheat and rice, are well able to take advantage of more open trading markets. But Ronald Steele points out that initiatives like the GATT Agreement and the North American Free Trade Area, NAFTA, don't benefit all Americans equally.
America's economic strength must be part of its foreign policy goals. That's fine. However, economic strength is often described in the aggregate without ever breaking it down into who benefits and who loses. Therefore, if we can get a deal whereby the major motor companies will benefit from greater access to the Japanese market, for example, or Intel will benefit by being able to sell its chips everywhere, that the economy as a whole will advance. True. But individuals don't advance just because the economy advances. And so the price of that which is really a very conservative program, is that certain sectors of the economy are going to suffer from it. And if you look at the NAFTA agreement and the GATT agreement, both of those singled out certain declining industries, if you will, as redundant, and the people who work in them redundant as well. And the ultimate cost of that has been increasing social instability.
Over the last 20 years, while the gross national product has grown and some people have become enormously better off, the real average wage in America has not gone up. The same big corporations that benefit most from international trade have been shedding workers. It's easy for people to see their own economic problems, including unemployment and the fear of losing their jobs, as the fault of foreign competition. So, is there a danger that economic fear will lead to a retreat from internationalism? Walter Russell Mead, a foreign affairs specialist at the World Policy Institute in New York, believes there could be.
In my view, what we need to do in the United States is, again, to have a view of an economic order, a global economic order that makes sense, that obviously to the average American family makes sense in terms of that their standard of living is better, they are benefiting from the existence of a global economy and their participation in it. The weak point right now, and this is a real problem in American politics, is that the people who are liberal internationalists and who are looking for an international trading and economic system on liberal terms have not found a way to regulate that order in ways that work toward the interests of average, ordinary people. I think this is not just a U.S. problem, but I think in Europe also it's an issue. One of these areas is low-wage competition, or countries that don't require industry to follow expensive environmental regulations and so on. And I think the task for those of us who are genuinely committed to responsible internationalism, to free trade and market societies, that our responsibility is to find ways for the global order increasingly to reflect economic and social values that make that order sustainable and defensible from both a moral and a practical point of view.
In practice, it may be tougher than Walter Mead thinks to reconcile these powerful conflicting interests. But where he's surely right is that economic pressures are helping to forge a new mood among Americans. For one thing, they simply don't want to be taken for granted anymore. During the Cold War, Americans were happy to see the economic strength of Europe and Japan as strategic assets for a common alliance. Now, increasingly, they don't see why they should subsidize foreigners who are as rich as they are. And this is not just a matter of economics. The same mood affects attitudes to foreign policy more generally. Hank Brown is a Republican senator and a leading member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
The U.S. is firmly committed to an active role in international affairs. We're the biggest trading nation in the world. We export and import more goods than any nation on the face of the earth, and we'll continue to do so. Our economy is more integrated. Our markets are more open than any country in the world of our size, and more open than any country anywhere except for a few like Hong Kong and others. No, this is a country that's firmly committed to the international scene and to play an active role. But there is a change afoot, and it's this. Americans are at a point they can no longer afford to pay a disproportionate share of the cost. In trade relations, we need to insist on equal access to markets and no longer can open our market to countries that keep theirs closed to us. And in terms of international defense efforts, it means we're at a stage where we want to pay our proportionate share, but we think it's a mistake to pay a disproportionately large share, which we've been doing.
I think there's been a fundamental transformation in the way that Americans look on the world, and I don't think either our elites or our allies have understood it.
Bill Maines, editor of the journal Foreign Policy.
America used to be a power that maybe in its hubris or in its commitment to a certain vision of world order carried disproportionate responsibilities and obligations, and we did it quite willingly. This permitted Kennedy to stand up and be applauded when he said we would bear any burden and pay any price. The United States is not in a mood now to carry a disproportionate burden. Yet American foreign policy traditionally has rested on the assumption that we would act disproportionately. The current mood of the American people is to do their share.
American foreign policy has to be adjusted to that new reality. If you look at the polls that are coming out of places like the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, they describe the results as pragmatic internationalism. Well, what does pragmatic internationalism mean? It means I'm for involvement in the international community as long as it helps me. That is not the attitude the United States had for 50 years. It had quite the opposite attitude.
If Americans don't want to do more than their fair share of the work, it also seems to be the case that in many places people resent American leadership as it's traditionally been interpreted. The U.S. military presence is not always as welcome as it was. In Japan, for instance, a recent rape allegedly committed by American servicemen has led to nationwide demonstrations against the presence of U.S. troops. Moreover, America's role as the world's policeman may no longer be appropriate to the kinds of challenges it now faces. In a multipolar world, it's less possible than it once was for the United States to go it alone. Congressman Lee Hamilton.
We can't solve many of the problems in the world today by unilateral U.S. action. We have to realize that here. You cannot have sanctions against Iraq unless the world agrees with you. You can't do much about Iran. We're not having all that much success getting our friends to cooperate with us with regard to Iran. So we in this country have to recognize that as strong as we are and as powerful as we are, nonetheless, the objectives that we seek around the world, whether it's lessening the explosive growth of population, improving the environment or security, extending democracy, we have to have the cooperation of a lot of friends and allies.
One very natural way for the United States to adjust to this new world would be to take a policy decision to work much more through international and multilateral agencies such as the United Nations. But after Somalia, the Clinton administration has shied away from the UN. Indeed, it's resisted attempts to leave the UN to solve the crisis in the former Yugoslavia and pursued its own diplomatic initiatives instead. Jim Hogue of Foreign Affairs.
It's both necessary and healthier that America continue to pursue, however sloppy it is from time to time, these efforts that I think are underway to find collaborative, collegial ways of dealing with a lot of problems in this world. You might say, well, if that's the case, why have you been so hard on the UN? And it's a very good question. This administration thinks that it has made a strategic mistake, I think, in shifting blame to the UN and allowing the UN to go unattended, that it is now a real obstacle to their view of how to lead multilaterally. So I would expect over the next 2-3 months that you will see a major initiative from this administration to the Congress on how to revive the UN, how to revive America's role in it. Yes, it will involve our paying back over a scheduled period of time our past dues, but it will involve a lot more than that, a specific reform program that I think this administration will put its name on and commit to. And in return for that, offer the Congress two things. One, much greater involvement in decisions about how we interact with the UN, particularly in peacekeeping. And secondly, a say in how our overdue dues are paid back in relationship to the amount of progress on the reform front at the United Nations.
Of course, it would be possible to clean up the United Nations Act, to modernize its structures, stamp out waste, and make the whole ramshackle apparatus more effective. But would this make Americans more enthusiastic about working through a world body that's ultimately outside their control? Or is there something about the American view of the world that means that the UN is to be avoided precisely because it's not American-led? There is a contradiction in American attitudes to leadership, says Robert Zellick, who was a high official in the State Department during the Bush administration.
There's certainly a belief that the United States has carried the major burden over the course of the Cold War, and perhaps a sense that it's time for others, both Europe and Japan and others in Asia, to take on some of the responsibilities. At the same time, I think there's almost a gut sense that Europe as a whole and Japan aren't ready to do that. And so it creates a tension where on the one hand there's a sense that, why are these burdens always being put on the United States? On the other hand, there's probably a certain pride while also recognizing that there's no one else that can do it in the United States. So the task, frankly, for effective leadership is to tap that interest and recognition of the special U.S. leadership role while putting together coalitions that help get the American people to feel that others are playing an important and useful role.
Ronald Reagan was immensely popular because he stressed what is sometimes called American exceptionalism, the idea that the United States is a city on a hill, a country with a unique moral nature, and with a historic mission to bring freedom to the world. In Ronald Reagan's day, the mission was a crusade against the evil empire of communism. President Clinton has tried to adapt the exceptionalist instinct to a far more complicated world by promising to enlarge the area of democracy. But for Bill Clinton, as for Reagan, free markets are just as much part of democracy as free speech. Jeremy Rosner, now with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, is a former Clinton speechwriter.
This administration has talked about the promotion and the support of democracy and free markets abroad as a centerpiece of its foreign policy. Now, I don't think they mean it in the same way that Woodrow Wilson did, which was sort of a dewy-eyed democracy everywhere, and democracy will solve all problems. We need to banish balance of power politics in order to banish war. I don't think it's that kind of naivete. I'd classify it as somewhat closer to Ronald Reagan's school. It was Ronald Reagan, after all, who set up an American program to support grassroots democracy promotion and the promotion of civil society abroad and organizations such as Solidarity in Poland. And this administration has been solidly behind those sort of efforts and has stressed the support of democracy and free markets in places like Russia and Central and Eastern Europe, where it will make the most difference to American interests. So it's not sort of democracy everywhere at all costs, but in the places that are of geostrategic significance to the United States, it does make a good deal of sense to help the consolidation and expansion of democracy and free markets. And that's what Bill Clinton, I think, meant by the concept of enlargement, to enlarge the community of market democracies.
It's striking that someone as close to Clinton should so explicitly compare what Clinton's trying to do to Reagan, the most conservative American president in this century. This evangelical rhetoric seems necessary to rally support for foreign ventures. But does it reflect the substance of Clinton's policy? Bill Maines of Foreign Policy warns that we should distinguish between what the administration says and what it does.
If you actually look at what the United States is doing in the world, it is not following that policy in China. It is not following that policy in the Arab world. It rhetorically is following that policy in Russia, but we endorsed Yeltsin's bombing of the parliament, which at least some people don't find consistent with the idea of enlarging democracy. It looks less and less like an intelligent decision in retrospect. So I think that in practical terms, the United States hopes that democracy will enlarge. At the margin, we will assist it. But the main focus of American foreign policy has been trying to establish some kind of reasonable relationship with the main power centers in the world, while at the same time protecting the close ties that we have with Western Europe and Japan. It seems to me that has been the direction of the administration's real foreign policy, as opposed to this rhetorical call which reflects aspirations more than resources and commitment.
If Bill Maines is right, President Clinton could find that this is one of the dangers of what he wants his countrymen to do in Bosnia. They may grow impatient of the humdrum job of tidying up a murderous mess, with all the far from idealistic deals that have been made. What the American public do like to do, as the Republican Congressman Chris Cox makes plain, is to crusade for their own ideals of freedom and democracy.
I'm troubled by the Clinton administration's policy toward Bosnia because it is so obviously built upon the notion that we have neither friend nor foe in the region. We are supposed to be punctiliously neutral and insert 25,000 troops into the middle of what may become three-way crossfire. When that crossfire commences, if it is, for example, Bosnians seeking to regain some of the territory stolen from them by Serbs, we will shoot the Bosnians because they are, from that standpoint, the aggressors. I don't know that one can use the military to deliver so subtle a point. There isn't a military mission here beyond getting shot at when hostilities ensue. I would much prefer that we brought ourselves to the point where we could distinguish friend from foe, where we could distinguish aggressor from oppressed. And if we were to do that, I would not mind at all committing on the side of freedom and fighting for it to a military victory.
Americans have shown that they have quite a taste for short, relatively painless victories against well-defined enemies, like those Ronald Reagan won in Libya and Grenada, or George Bush's in Panama and the Gulf, but less stomach for moral ambivalence or open-ended commitments in Vietnam, in the Lebanon, and perhaps in Bosnia. But while the American public may complain about the costs of world leadership, they also want to maintain the ability to exercise it. Jim Hogue, editor of Foreign Affairs.
The public has not called for massive cuts in the defense budget, and there have not been. Yes, there have been some scaling backs. It would be sheer idiocy if there weren't some. In fact, they're rather substantial. But what is left is a military inordinately larger than anyone else's, with annual budgets that are larger than virtually everybody else's put together, and therefore the likelihood that we will not only keep a size edge, but we will keep a technological edge in the capabilities of making warfare. So I think, in the sense of understanding after the 20th century, that can be a very unsafe world, and rather quickly. The United States will not be going back into some neutralized pacifist posture of a big continental economy, but with a small security apparatus.
On the contrary, it's been striking how much more willing Americans have been to cut other international programs, such as foreign aid, rather than the defense budget. But for what purposes should these expensive high-tech forces be used? Congressman Lee Hamilton observes that his countrymen seem to want to have it both ways.
The American people are very ambivalent about leadership. On the one hand, they like to claim that we're the only country that can bring Rabin and Arafat together for a handshake. We're the leader, we're the dominant military power in the world. They're all very proud of that. They like to think of themselves as the leader in the world. At the same time, they have a very great reluctance to put up the resources to maintain the leadership, and they do not like to put young men and young women into places of danger.
That ambivalence and the reluctance to risk lives in other people's conflicts are understandable. But the evidence of the recent past suggests that they can be overcome when there are clear objectives related to America's values and interests. Americans are happy to engage with the world so long as they can fulfill their sense of mission and feel that they're in charge. They're keen to work for more open trade because they know it's in their own interests. The immediate issue is Bosnia, and there's some evidence from recent polls that public opinion is beginning to move in favor of American military involvement. But a far more important issue lies behind it, the credibility and survival of the NATO alliance itself. President Clinton has committed himself to the plan for NATO to expand, to include at least some of the newly democratic nations of Eastern Europe. His former speechwriter, Jeremy Rosner, argues that this will be a much more significant test of American policy.
If we end up, the U.S. and our allies in NATO, end up voting to add new members, we will have, in fact, at a time when we're perceived to be isolationist, voted to take on commitments. At a time when we're perceived to be unilateralist, decide to proceed multilaterally. At a time when we're considered to be cheap and unwilling to spend money, we will have voted to spend money for a new initiative. And at a time that we're perceived to be unwilling to risk lives, we will have agreed to be willing to die for Prague or Bratislava or whichever country it is that's added to the alliance. That might transform very much perceptions the world has of our posture.
The United States is perfectly willing to take on responsibility on its own terms. To do so under the banner of the United Nations has no appeal. To do so through NATO, which is American-led and perceived almost as an extension of American policy, is more than acceptable. Americans are proud of world leadership and of their military might. They'd like to see a Middle East peace agreement sealed on the White House lawn, even if it was brokered by the Norwegians. Even better would be a handshake there between Gerry Adams and the Reverend Ian Paisley. There remains a deep conviction that it's the unique destiny of the United States to bring its own political and economic system to as much of the world as possible. Where does this leave the rest of us? Americans point out that we in Europe especially are quick to denounce American interference and then just as quick to call for American help when we need it. They're right. What Europe needs to do, gradually but firmly, is to kick the habit of dependence on the United States. We have to hope that the United States will restrain those missionary instincts and learn to work with other powers, not as the last superpower, but as first among equals. But then, of course, the rest of us, too, will have to accept a fair share of the burdens of maintaining this international order.
Analysis, The Last Superpower, was presented by Godfrey Hodgson, Director of the Reuter Foundation Programme at Green College, Oxford, and was produced by Anthony Dworkin. The editor is Nicola Merrick.